I'd like to introduce today's session, this afternoon's session, the first session of the afternoon, which is a panel discussion on enhancing resilience and social, and it's related to local government's role in strengthening community resilience to political mobilization and social division in local contexts. To take us through this session, I'd like to introduce our two speakers, panelists, Dr. Mario Peucker, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Industries and Livable Cities at Victoria University, and a senior fellow at the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right. He also co-leads Stream 4 of CRIS's research into the dynamics of violent extremism. Joining him is Cristina del Frate, who is a senior coordinator in the Community Development Unit at Yarra City Council. Within the notes attached to the meeting are more details, biographies of both Mario and Cristina. I'd remind the audience about the Q&A function, through which we invite you to ask questions as the presentations are proceeding. And after the presentations by Mario and Cristina, we will have an opportunity to answer those questions and for them to have a dialogue about the issues that they've raised. With that, I'll hand over to Mario to start off with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for the nice introduction. Hello, everyone. Because I missed the acknowledgement to country this morning, I would like to start our presentation by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. I'm on Bonbarung land of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging leaders, and especially everyone from the Aboriginal community and Torres Strait Islander community that might be here today. Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. Thanks again, Mark, for the introduction. We are presenting together on local government's role in strengthening community resilience to political mobilization and social division in local contexts. So at the center of this, this presentation, which is hopefully not longer than 20 minutes, is that we are trying to explore and discuss local factors that can influence community resilience to socially harmful, divisive, and anti-egalitarian narratives and actions. What we have in mind is far-right mobilization, but this can also apply to many other things. And what comes to mind is the most recent, obviously, anti-lockdown mobilization that I wouldn't consider to be far-right, but that's a separate issue. But it is certainly harmful, divisive, and probably also anti-egalitarian. The second point that we are trying to explore is how these local factors can influence either increase or decrease the chances of community-driven grassroots counter-mobilization to those divisive narratives and actions. First, I would like to say a few things about the project, because what I'm going to present are the outcomes of a research project that we did last year and the year before. Then at the center of the presentation, the main questions is around vulnerability and protective factors. Obviously, the protective factors relate to resilience factors. Understanding local grievances, community grievances is one part, civil society structures, local pride, civic engagement is a second, and then spatial considerations as a third. And the last part is relatively short, and I hope that leads to a conversation. Certainly it's going to lead to Cristina's presentation, is the role of local government in all this. So a few words about the project. It was called Dissenting Citizenship, ? Understanding Vulnerabilities to Far-Right Mobilization on the Local Level. It's conducted 2019 and 2020, funded by the Victorian Department of Justice and Community Safety. We did that at Victoria University together with my colleagues Ramon Spar, Scott Patton, and Deborah Smith. Very importantly, it was done in partnership with 3 local councils, the City of Greater Bendigo, City of Melton, and City of Yarra. And that's a reason why Cristina is here with us today as the co-presenter. So we created 3 local case studies for each of those 3 local government areas by drawing on a range of different sources, interviews, observations, ABS data, Australian the Electoral Commission data, media report, a lot of stuff. I don't want to go into the details of the methodology at all, actually. I mean, happy to answer questions later, but I think it's more about the outcomes. What was at the center of that project was to understand far-right dynamics in a local context, and also understand, probably more importantly, community, the factors that influence those and shape those local incidents, and also the response to those far-right incidents. Before I go to the main findings that I want to present here, I would like to say that it's really important to understand that any municipality could potentially be affected. We've seen across at least 10 different local government areas, we've seen far-right protests that can happen anywhere. It's not a reflection of sort of being a hotspot of, you know, far-right thinking or narratives or groups. It can happen anywhere. Okay, so this is probably the most, for me, the most important question is, in order to understand those divisive actions and mobilization attempts, we have to understand and acknowledge the locally specific grievances in the local communities. And what I'm going to talk about now is what we learned from our study in those 3 local government areas. But the main point is that in each local government area, we have to, when we expect or see such incidents, it's important to really try to understand and assess the local situation, what's going on in our local communities. And it's often, from what we've learned, an interplay between socioeconomic, cultural, and psychological factors that play together there. I just want to give share a few findings from our study. So the first one, socioeconomic transformation, and related to that, cultural shifts. That's something we saw, for example, in Bendigo, where people often spoke about the rise of a new Bendigo. Bendigo used to be, you know, a quite laid-back farming, working class, regional center, but in the last 10, 15 years, or maybe more, it has become sort of very there's more art galleries have popped up, the vineyards, tourism. It has changed a lot. And people who used to shape the cultural climate, the cultural understanding of what is the social norms in Bendigo used to be more working class. All of a sudden, it is what could be perceived as sort of left-leaning progressive elites, as some people would have called them. So people who used to be the ones in control or felt in control, white Christian working class people, they feel like some of their power and privilege is sort of drifting away. And that was part of the reason why in Bendigo there was a relatively easy to mobilize or to recruit people from the local community into far-right activities in Bendigo. There's been a lot of discussion around this, and lots has been written about this in the US, for example. Hyde spoke about the status quo conservatives that sort of fight against, not physically fighting, but are pitched against the progressive liberal globalists. Or a recent book by Sandel, The Tyranny of Merit, where he talks about the hubris of the well-educated towards the working class, and the working class then feels like they are falling behind. They are for no fault of their own, as some people said in our study in Bendigo, as you see from that bubble on the right. There's a sense of feeling, a sense of losing control over what's happening to our local community. That was one factor, and we need to understand those grievances, this origin of those grievances. Another factor that we saw, for example, very clearly in Melton was demographic changes. Melton also used to be a very homogeneous, culturally homogeneous, white Anglo-Christian farming area for a long time, or at least a sort of a township, but it has changed a lot within the last 15 years, and it has become one of the fastest growing and most diverse areas in Australia in a very short period of time. With those transformations, these very rapid transformations and diversification, people feel like, again, people who used to be able to define what Melton really is, seem to feel, or some of them feel that they're losing that control over their local area. And new developments pop up, and it's often those people from diverse backgrounds that are quite socially mobile and quite affluent or relatively affluent, and they're going there to buy their first house and build new areas with new infrastructure. And what happens is that those who have been there for a long time, for generations, they see that, and there's what some people call us, like, there's envy towards those people. And that was one of the grievances, or fed into those grievances locally. And that word bubble on the right, one person said, when people drive past the new developments every day, they see those nice cars and houses and everything from the new migrants that moved there. And that constantly reminds people of their resentments. So that's another factor, it's the demographic change. One point that many people mentioned was that media reporting fuels community sentiments and fears. That's obviously not a new thing, but we are all aware of this. In Bendigo, it was in particular the moral panic around anti-Islam. ISIS was on the front page every day, sensationalist media reporting. So it fueled a deep sense of fear and sentiments towards Islam in parts of the community, obviously not only in Bendigo, but across the country and beyond. In Melton, we saw a lot of, that spilled into the Melton situation as well, with the mosque protests in Melton, but also racialized gang crimes in 2017 and 18 that was very dominant in the community grievances. There was really an extremely high level of fear in the community. And these fears obviously have to be taken seriously, regardless of whether they are a realistic reflection of like a crime wave which didn't really exist. And all of this together is linked to the last point, a sense of not being heard. And we saw that in many different local contexts. In Bendigo, for example, in the context of the mosque protests, became so out of control and aggressive and confrontational that the Bendigo Council was not able to channel that into its normal consultation processes. So they basically shut down parts of the conversation. And that led to people feeling actually more marginalized and silenced, and that contributed to the grievances. One person that I interviewed there, who are quite embedded and sort of a sympathizer embedded in the far right, said to me, we were all yelling and screaming and no one was listening. And that was when they sort of attached themselves to far right groups that mobilized around there and used that opportunity in Bendigo for their own purposes. Some people I interviewed in Bendigo also said there's a loud Bendigo. And what he meant was that the loud Bendigo is the progressive Bendigo that shapes the culture and the norms of what can be said and should be said in Bendigo. But this loud Bendigo reflects only half, according to that person, half of the population. And the other population actually doesn't like that, but has no way of expressing its critical views on whether it's safe schools or it's gender diversity, things like that. So they feel silenced and alienated locally. So the second issue that is related to that, but is also sort of revolves around the counter-mobilization to divisive mobilization or actions in a local area. What and when and why do local communities and civil society become active against those divisive public actions, and what influences that? What creates that resilience to stand up and mobilize against division and hatred, you could say, or anger, that kind of anger. So what we identified is on a few different levels. Maybe I should say that we saw, for example, in Bendigo, after a certain period of far-right mobilization, there was a grassroots-driven mobilization against that in Bendigo, and that changed the culture and the climate in the local area. That was very pro-diversity, pro-mosque and others. Whereas we didn't see that in Melton for various reasons, and I'm not saying that Melton is particularly it's bad or good, it's just that certain factors didn't align that well in Melton that led to the lack of that counter-mobilization, also because the process was short. The Bendigo process of anti-mosque mobilization was quite long. It gave people in civil society more time. But what we found are some of the key factors that influence that, what could be linked to community resilience, the existing civil society structures, the landscape. How many civil society organizations do we have in a certain area, and how are they connected? Is there someone who could take the leadership and lead basically a counter protest, and mobilize a large group of local residents? So that's the structural element. Then there was one thing that we discovered or what we found quite obvious, is that there are certain preconditions. What are the propensities to becoming civically, politically engaged at all? What are the volunteering rate is, for example, a good indicator of how willingly and how inclined people in a certain local area is to mobilize and get active against divisive developments. Related to volunteering, but also more generally to engagement, is the capacity. Do we have the time resources? That's related to your working hours, your working commitment. Do I have to commute? Do I spend half of my day in the car going to work and coming back? What is the public transport? Do I work where I live? Things like that influences the time resources. We, for example, heard people in Bendigo tell us, we leave the house at 7:30 in the morning, spend 2 hours in traffic to get to work, then go back, come home at 7:30. There's not much time and energy left to actually organize on a civil society level. And lastly, the motivation on an individual level. What is the motivation? And that's for me the most interesting, or particularly interesting point, because it sort of brings all the different structural and meso-level factors together. What is the attitude towards and the commitment to pro-diversity activism? And in Bendigo, people became very committed to standing up for diversity and multiculturalism, also relating to the long history of Bendigo's multiculturalism. Whereas in other places, people told us, for example, standing up against divisive mobilization, that's the hobby of the affluent, educated people. It's not what we do here. So this is not what we do. This is not our business to mobilize against divisive rhetoric. That's a very important element. And that person said about themselves that we are not affluent and educated, so we don't do that. Another point really important is a sense of local pride and positive local identification. When something happens in my local area, I have to ask myself, is it worth to invest energy and become committed to mobilize against that divisive, even if I'm against that or I don't support that mosque conflict or the anti-mosque sentiments, but is it worth standing up against those who express those? And in Bendigo, people said to us, we need to do that. Our community is better than that. There was a very strong sense of local pride, and this is what drove people into activism. Whereas in other areas, people said to us, it's not our fight. This has nothing to do with me. I don't care. We are seen as the bogan town anyway, so why would I stand up for my local community? So a sense of local pride and positive local identity is really a key factor in mobilizing against divisive, or in our case, far-right mobilization. And the last point in that section is to look at spatial considerations. How can we, through various forms of urban planning and spatial planning, change resilience, change the willingness and the commitment to the resilience and to far-right mobilization or divisive mobilization, and the willingness to stand up against it, so to become involved in counter-mobilizing. Personal and structural connectedness and spatial factors are really central in this when we look at the local level. One question that I mentioned before is, do we live where we work? That was something that was really important. That affects many different things. It affects the way we identify locally. If I live where I work, that's a higher chance that I actually identify with this local area. It gives me a better opportunity to connect. I have more time to connect. I feel like this is my community. So this influences that kind of community resilience a lot. Segregation levels was a big factor. There was a study done in the US, in the UK, sorry, where leaked membership documents from the British Nationalist Party, a British National Party, like a far-right party. The membership list leaked, and people got hold of that membership list and identified where those members live. And what they found is that they lived in areas that are, broadly speaking, quite diverse, but within that diverse area, the diversity was quite segregated. So in a way, people from white background saw diversity basically on the other side of the fence. It was close, but it was not close enough to engage with them. So it was close enough to be seen as a threat, but it was not close enough to develop interpersonal contacts. And that was seen as a risk factor by Biggs and Knaus, a risk factor of far-right mobilization, but also a risk factor for community resilience and community cohesion. Obviously, connecting people from different groups is a key factor there to also decrease threat perceptions. And as I said before, urban and spatial planning affect those cross-community interaction opportunities and perceptions. And this is very broad, and I found that quite fascinating, that it includes not only whether we put a park there where people could meet, but engaging in, thinking about how do we zone a certain new development? Do we allow local businesses, local shopping, like a milk bar on a corner shop, do we allow that in a certain area? Or do we force people that sort of move in a certain area, in a new development, for example, they can't shop locally. They have to drive to a central shopping mall to do all their shopping, where there's limited opportunity to engage with each other? Or do we zone differently? How do we develop new housing developments? What's the social planning element in this? All these things, and you see, I'm not suggesting I'm not making any clear suggestions there or how we can fix that or we can resolve that. It's just about thinking about those issues that would be really important. My last slide, the role of local government. In our study, we found one key element was how united or divided is a council. If in Bendigo, for example, the council was during the mosque protest divided with one in particular councillor being quite anti-mosque, and that gave sort of inroads into that conflict, so that fueled that conflict even more. So the division and political unity on the leadership level, the political leadership level locally. But one big question is also, how does a local council that is committed to a progressive agenda, how do they pursue that agenda if they know that there are parts in the community, or sometimes quite significant segments of the community, that are actually not on board with that progressive agenda? How do we balance that? We can't just say, well, then we don't pursue the progressive agenda because this is sort of, we even have to, according to the human rights, Bill of Human Rights in Victoria, but how do we balance those conflicting issues? And we developed sort of a 4-level cycle of prevention and intervention. I don't want to go into detail there. I'm happy to discuss this later, but I just want to say a few words about the prevention and the 4 stages. The prevention is about promoting diversity, inclusion, and human rights on a local level, but it is also creating opportunities for cross-community engagement and equal access to decision-making for all residents, basically. Early intervention is also part of that model, where we don't just celebrate diversity and bring people together, but we also acknowledge that conflicts are inevitable and not a problem in itself. Conflicts are fine and okay as long as we manage those properly. How do we create safe spaces for having difficult conversations? How do we prevent conflicts? How does a local council mediate before a conflict escalates? These are all questions that we have to ask, instead of just hoping that we can all, celebrate diversity with food and in multicultural festivals, which is important, but it is not the only thing. Conflicts will arise, and the question is, how do we respond to that? What do we do if someone expresses racist views, for example? The third point is being prepared in local council. I think that Cristina is going to say a few words about their experiences when they made the decision in the council about January 26th about the Australia Day, not celebrating formally in the council, and there was a far-right protest in the council, quite disruptive and confrontational. How do we prepare for those incidents, or also less confrontational or less aggressive incidents? And lastly, and that's my last point, how do we analyze the community tensions and the grievances that do exist locally in order to understand what kind of prevention and early intervention we need in order to create community resilience and or strengthen community resilience? So that brings us back to that, what I said before, the grievances, understanding the grievances. Good, I think I stop here and hand over to Cristina.
Yep. Thank you very much, Mario. Before we move to Cristina's presentation, we have a few questions in the Q&A section, but I'd remind people if you could start putting your questions in there so that after Cristina's presentation, we can move into the discussion. So Cristina, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
I'm Cristina del Frate. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Community Development Senior Coordinator at Yarra City Council. Thanks so much for having me here. I also would like to acknowledge that I come to you from the Bunurong, the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to acknowledge the elders and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Thank you once again for having me here. My perspective here is from the local government perspective, obviously, and I was very fortunate to have been what our council was part of the research that Mario and colleagues had undertaken. So my aim is to give you some examples of some of the work that has been done in Yarra in response to some of the points that Mario has made around prevention and responding to far-right mobilisation or divisive community action. I am definitely not here to tell you that Yarra has all the answers or that we get it right all the time. Definitely not. There's a lot of amazing work that's been conducted by lots of local governments around Victoria and Australia, and I believe there's a great value in learning from my colleagues and sharing that knowledge. I wanted to let you know that one of the best ways of combating divisive behaviour we've found is in getting together with your colleagues, and which is something that we've done in the past with Mario's assistance at Vic Uni, and sharing the learnings that we have each other. Before I go into that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a brief snapshot about Yarra. So I won't go into it too much, it's just about setting that context, but we have just over 100,000 people. Obviously, this is from the 2016 ABS data. We have a very socio-economically and culturally diverse community in Yarra, and the average age of people is about 33, which is, compared to Greater Melbourne, is 36. We're a little bit younger. In terms of cultural diversity, we have 61% of residents are born in Australia, which means around 29% of residents are born overseas, compared to Greater Melbourne's which is about 34%. Top 3 countries of birth have changed in recent years, and the latest results is telling us that it's UK, Vietnam and New Zealand, although we have quite diverse populations living in the public housing estates in Yarra, of which we have quite a number. 22% of people in Yarra speak a language other than English at home, compared to 32% for Greater Melbourne. And while it's not reflected in these slides, Yarra is also characterised by lower unemployment rates, with a high proportion of residents who work as managers or professionals, and we have higher weekly income levels compared to the Victorian average. In saying that, though, while overall it's characterised by an affluent population, the municipality also has, and prides itself really, the highest proportion of social housing residents and households across Victoria. So approximately 8,000 residents are living in public housing, which is around 1 in 10. So quite a disparity between various groups. And while Mario's research in his findings found that while there's not a lot of far-right activity that's generated within Yarra, it does attract quite a bit. And I think he made the point earlier that it can certainly happen anywhere. No one is immune, no area is immune from it, no matter how socially progressive the local government is, the councillors are. It can be a bit of a draw card. So I'll just go to the next slide, which Mario referred to around the January 26 decision that council had made. And I guess this is the most prominent incident involving far-right groups to target Yarra in recent years. And it occurred in response to the council's decision in August in 2017 to no longer hold citizenship ceremonies on the 26th of January, Australia Day. This decision was made in an effort to show respect to local Indigenous communities and acknowledge the historical injustices of dispossession and violence during the colonisation of Australia. The decision resulted in two events really relevant to the issues of around what we're talking about today. First, there was an immediate backlash on social media, within the media as well, the mainstream media, and also with direct correspondence to council. And second, a few weeks later, there was a public stunt by one of the far-right group disrupting a public Yarra council meeting. So in terms of the backlash that council experienced, it definitely occurred alongside the mainstream media coverage. It really generated a huge amount of media coverage at the time. I think because we were the first council to make that sort of decision. Other councils had made similar decisions, but to go to the point of actually saying no more citizenship ceremonies, etc. on that day, it was, I guess, it drew a lot of attention. I think we received something like 2,000 emails and calls within that first week just on that topic. About 70% were negative toward the council decision, and there were frequent personal attacks and openly expressed hatred and disgust towards our then mayor and CEO. I must say that most of those that we could track were outside of the Yarra municipality. Most of the supporters were within Yarra. So we attracted a lot of attention right across all of Australia. So there was a common consensus among council staff that they were not prepared for this. Our centralised database of incoming correspondences, as I said, it detected 2,000 messages within that first week or two that also required a response. So not only were people sort of receiving a lot of abuse and negative sort of type of messages, we were having to actually respond and prepare things. So that was one aspect of that decision. Then 2 weeks after the decision, there was a small group of individuals from a far right, I think they were linked to various far right groups or the one from outside of Yarra, staged a protest inside Richmond Town Hall. They gathered outside and then came in and they had placards and shouting slogans, and you'll see that that's the photo in the bottom right-hand corner. So what did we learn from that? We probably became a little bit more risk averse, unfortunately, from that. It was quite a shock to see the level of anger directed towards council for this, and I guess from each year from then, whenever there's a Jan 26 planning of an event, or when we're leading up to it, we form an internal working group. We get together and we look at what risks we may need to mitigate. What are we planning? And you know, we're far more sort of focused on sort of preventing anything further from happening. And I must say that since then we have not received the same level of ire or you know, aggression, I guess. So Also, in conjunction with the Jan 26 decision, an education campaign was developed, and that was developed in partnership with other organisations in Yarra, including schools, community groups, community organisations, and it was all around explaining what the decision was and myth busting. For example, you know, how the decision was made and the level of consultation that went into it. You know, questions around, does this mean council is anti-Australia Day? All those sorts of things were addressed in that campaign, and you know, it was quite a big engagement process, engaging with those different groups. We had translations as well, and going out to our culturally and linguistically diverse groups to undertake that engagement. You know, an FAQ sheet was obviously developed, and the website was updated with all of that information as well. The monitoring of social media became more tightly controlled as well, in terms of ensuring that, you know, we kept an eye on comments and trolls, and trying to manage that. Yeah, so I guess that was sort of the outcome from the Jan 26 decision, and you know, there was a lot of learning. I think we had developed risk assessments in coming up to that decision, but I think we didn't really expect the level of response that we did receive back then. But yeah. I'll move to the next slide. I just wanted to talk about this instance, this example around preparedness to respond to divisive political mobilisation. So another example of how far-right groups impact on Yarra is in the area of racist and far-right sort of graffiti, and of which, you know, we've been subject to. There's been a whole range of things, from far-right posters, tagging of swastikas, as you can see, the Nilex silos there, and also tagging of right-wing phrases around the neighbourhoods. So I guess this is addressed in terms of at local government. How can we address this? We have graffiti strategies. All local governments will have these, and you know, we have a proviso in there in which anything, any graffiti that is racist or offensive in nature needs to be removed within 24 hours. And so, and you'll see that this is not groundbreaking. This happens right across local governments everywhere. Sometimes we can be a little bit hamstrung in that we aren't really supposed to remove graffiti from private property, but if it is racist in nature, we often do. So having a good relationship with the cleaning crews at council, and ensuring that anything that pops up gets addressed really quickly is important. So yeah, I've mentioned relationships there. So relationships within council is incredibly important, and that we've found that maintaining and those relationships, whether it's with cleaning crews, with communications, with events and permits people. You know, one of the really interesting examples that another LGA shared with us once was when a far-right group was mobilising to organise a protest in their LGA, and were applying for permits, or, you know, I'm not sure exactly the process that they were undergoing, but it meant that that council had had some warning, and so they were able to shift the protest or demonstration from a very main area where there was a lot of foot traffic, a lot of cars, where they would be very visible, to a much more quieter space where there was hardly any sort of visibility, and that was a really, I guess, effective way of mitigating that risk. So having those conversations with those teams who aren't really working in this space, you know, community development, we're working in the space of, you know, anti-racism and community engagement, but teams such as, you know, our events and permits people, that's not their bread and butter. So having those relationships means that we can, you know, work at preventing things like that happening. Another council, very funnily, were thinking, should we put the sprinklers on if they go into that park? But I don't think they did. So it was an interesting thought, though. Another thing that happens, and I think I've mentioned it there, yes, network relationships. So we have obviously very strong relationships with community organisations within Yarra, and we'll often hear, oh, I saw some stickering, which is some right-wing stickering and around this area. What can we do? I don't know what to do. So we get a lot of those questions. So it's been really helpful just to provide really clear instructions on, organisation-wide emails that go out to far and wide networks in Yarra around. If you see something of that nature, it's advised that you record the date and time that you saw it, take a photo if possible, advise council on this number, report it on this website, which is the Reporting Racism link that we have with Victorian Human Rights Commission. And so those instances will get recorded and reported there, which is fantastic. And so if you can send those clear instructions to your network organisation members, it's also really helpful in that sense. And of course, taking a publicly visible stance on social justice issues is also really important. So I'm very lucky that I work for a council that does this on, quite regularly, and we have the banners that are shown there in the slide on welcoming refugees and people seeking asylum. We also have the We Stand Together project, which was one that we undertook with our partners in Yarra, other organisations, and so having those signs, also make a big difference. And the last slide I wanted to talk about, just as another example, is around conflicts in local neighbourhoods. And I've listed there the service that our Neighbourhood Justice Centre provides, which is called the Peacemaking Project. The Neighbourhood Justice Centre in Yarra, just for those who aren't aware of it, is it's a one-stop shop that includes three arms of justice, which is the police, courts and corrections. And they also have a raft of support services and agencies and crime prevention focused community engagement teams. So they're not just about delivering sort of the justice system, they're around the community engagement crime prevention sort of space, which is fantastic. One of the programs that are based there is the peacemaking service, and it helps people who are affected by conflict or crime. It's essentially, it's a facilitated conversation that's run by a mediator from the NJC, trained in, specialised in sort of conflict resolution. And the conversation often includes an exploration of what happened, how all parties were affected, and an attempt to find the solutions. And this service is available for whether it's two people or a group of people, whether they're strangers or not, or known to each other. And it's quite an excellent service. And just one last example in terms of what's gone on in Yarra in the past, and it would have been great to have had this service back then, but quite a few years ago we had an incident that evolved after some conflict and police involvement at a music venue in Yarra one evening. Some conflict arose between young people from Pacific Islander and African backgrounds at an event that was organised and organised by and aimed at communities, young people of African background living in Melbourne. The event led to someone being injured, unfortunately, on the night, and police and media being involved. And so it's sort of digressed down to many music venue owners and managers in Yarra expressing their concern at holding any further events that were of that origin, that were African themed or led, which was really concerning for us. We could see that this would be potentially very harmful and divisive for the community. We have a significant African background community in Yarra, and this would inflame tensions. So at the time we helped, as council, having that sort of centralised coordinating effort, we organised to have various stakeholders get together to discuss their grievances. So it included the music venue owners and operators, performing artists, community leaders, police, legal, community legal service people, and council effectively acted as a mediator in that sort of setting and had that discussion. This discussion wasn't always great. It was, you know, tense and you know, it got a bit heated at times, but I guess it was a really great platform in which to have you know, everyone have their say and try and come to a win-win sort of solution. So that's all I was going to say in terms of you know, the examples that I had specifically. There, I have more, but I'd rather hear from you and also open up for questions. So I will stop sharing and give it back to Mark or Mario.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions here, and I will start off some of these questions and to Mario and Cristina, and I also understand Mario's got a few other points as well. One question that we have here is from a colleague in New South Wales who says, we are compiling a list of great examples of local grassroots social cohesion initiatives that can be used for inspiration by local government. We would be interested in your views on some excellent examples. So Cristina, Mario, any examples you'd like to share? Cristina.
Thank you. What a great question. Look, we see lots of great social cohesion examples, and you can right from events celebrating days of significance for cultural or language groups, religious groups that incorporate, you know, the broader community, right through to peer-led sort of education examples, where, you know, where they're sharing the learning and with broader communities. We have a community grants program at Yarra, which I think it's about $2 million per year, which goes out to community groups and, you know, community resilience, community strengthening. They're the themes that we really we look for in terms of those projects that we fund. And yeah, we do have some great ones. And I think the value in that is also in giving that opportunity back to communities to, you know, to empower them to organise what actually is meaningful for them and to assist in that interaction. Mario, did you have anything to add to that? I
think there's thousands and thousands of good grassroots community groups that are often under the radar and don't get the appreciation. Maybe they do not even want the recognition. They just want to do their work. Maybe two things that come to mind, or maybe to say a few things first. In terms of mobilizing against divisive actions in the local area, I think often we underestimate the importance of local grassroots. I think we sometimes point to government, state or local government, and sometimes those are in the least ideal position to respond. For example, in Bendigo, it came to a point where the council was seen as the enemy by those protesters. So the counter-mobilization had to come from civil society, because whatever the council could have done, it would have been seen as being problematic or had no power really in the community, in that part of the community. So I think that's just highlighting the importance of grassroots for many ways. I really think it's great if council and government and grassroots can work together, as Cristina, it happens a lot in Yarra, not so much in other places. Mobilizing against divisive actions we've seen in many places. I remember when there was a swastika shown in a regional town or small town in Victoria, the community came together and protested against it. They were not calling for police or for calling for outlawing or banning swastika. They just wanted to make a public stand, and they took a photo. And that was the most powerful message into the community, that our community doesn't want that here. Or there was when humanitarian refugees were settled in a municipality in the east of Melbourne, I think the far right tried to mobilize. The local communities straight away said, we don't want you people here, we want the refugees here. And there were grandmothers and grandfathers, and everyone was coming together. They were knitting outside and they were doing things together. Those are sometimes the most powerful messages that we can see. In terms of local grassroots for social cohesion, it just reminded me of a project we did in Wyndham separately, where we created a network, helped create, because it was created by grassroots communities themselves, to develop anti-racism support networks locally, like community-led initiatives where local community grassroots organizations become involved in becoming sort of contact points where the local community can turn to when they experience racism. And they were upskilled, and they created a network. I think that's a really beautiful initiative where local grassroots, they take matters into their own hand without being responsible for racism, but they become agents in that. And that was a very, for me, a very interesting example.
Thank you. The next question we have, Mario, is your view of how the 3 participating councils have taken the research you presented on board. Has it influenced their new council plans, for example?
Well, we did run workshops at the end in each council, and one of them was, I'll leave it up to Cristina to say a few things, how it influenced Yarra, but I do know that the other councils took that quite seriously and they took it on board. It's not that we told them what to do, that was not our purpose and our goal, but I think the conversations in councils has helped to change the conversations a little bit, to talk about issues that have popped up, and just maybe it reduced the defensiveness a little bit. That is understandable, the defensiveness, but if we all, one of the most important messages is to say what Cristina repeated before, that it's not a bad reflection on that particular local council. And if we get to that point where then we feel, I think that the councils felt more liberated to do something about it, to address it really. The biggest hurdle is to think it's bad for our, public, the public perception if we deal with this, because it looks like we have a particular problem. So I think that it has been taken on board gradually, and it's a learning process, and that's what we were hoping to achieve.
Mm. Yeah, I got to say that, Mario, it was definitely confirmed and consolidated, the direction, for Yarra. A lot of these issues we think doesn't impact us when we know, coming from a local government perspective and speaking to other local government sort of reps, we sort of think, oh, that's, it's not really our domain. But the research, I think, really consolidates that it is, and local government does have a space here, whether it's in the prevention or the responding sort of space. There are lots of opportunities for local government, and of course, we've got a social justice charter at Yarra, and the work that is encapsulated in this research fits very most definitely there. Our council plan, looks at issues of diversity and community resilience and celebrating that diversity, and also being actively anti-racism, actively promoting anti-racism sort of projects and campaigns. And I know other councils, have anti-racism policies and strategies, and but yeah, I think definitely some of that work does seep through in the policies and strategies at council.
Thank you. Mario, a question which I think is directed to you in particular, which is that can you reflect on religious groups and multi-faith involvement in the areas if you worked on? Has it been positive, negative, or neutral?
If I had to answer with one word, I would say positive. I think there are two separate questions. The first one is in there, 2 elements. The interfaith component is, I think, resonates quite well with what Cristina and I have been talking about the importance of cross-community engagement, bringing different groups together. That's obviously in interfaith councils, interfaith initiatives are very important component. We have to acknowledge, obviously, that those people who need it the most often don't, engage in that kind of interfaith work. So it has limited reach in that sense. Religious groups have always been very important, have always played a very important role in the settlement process for new arrivals, for people who come to a new place. It gives, what did Hirschman say, the Canadian sociologist, respect, resources, and something else like the 3R, I think he mentioned. Certainly gives people an opportunity to connect, to have, experience, develop some sort of place, find a place in a new environment, in the settlement and integration process. So in that sense, it's really important. I don't see how religious communities could be negative in that, unless they are very insular. And there are insular communities in all religious faith communities, I assume, but by and large, it's not like that. I mean, the absolutely false stereotype that, for example, Muslim communities are sort of inward looking is actually, and we've done research on this separate, not connected to this, completely wrong, that there are great opportunities in volunteering for your local mosque or your local temple or whatever, because it actually leads to a stronger sense of belonging to the wider society. We just need to connect different segments of religious communities. And for me, religious groups form just a normal, absolutely ordinary element of a diverse civil society. I don't see civil society as being a homogeneous, sort of predominantly white, established mainstream civil society. Society is diverse, and every organization, religious, multi-religious, multicultural, multi-ethnic, plays a very important role in that diverse civil society.
Cristina, any views on that question?
Yeah, I think that faith groups have a huge role to play, and having, again, it all comes down to relationships and ensuring that you have strong relationships with those main groups, because that's who, they're the ones, we need lots of different conduits to community, and so those faith groups are one of those conduits. And in Yarra we have such a diversity of faith groups, although on the ABS data I think that's sort of waning. We're having higher and higher numbers of people who are not affiliated with any religious groups. But for for those for the diverse populations, those faith groups are really important, and it's really important for local governments to have those strong relationships, to provide opportunities for those groups, to support their members. And we've always had really positive relationships. I think those faith groups are always really keen to ensure that their communities are, welcomed, and that people understand their perspective. We've always found them always wonderful and wanting to participate and give back to the community.
Thank you. Mario, in your presentation, you spoke about local grievances. We have a question about how we might analyze local grievances.
I think often people know the local grievances in local government, but they don't want to address them. I think that local government hears a lot about local grievances, but and I'm not looking at you, but because you were nodding. I don't work in local government, obviously, so it would be interesting to hear from Cristina what the avenues are that people use to to share those grievances. But I mean, we did it through our research, which is probably the most, well, sounds a bit arrogant maybe, but I mean, it is a more systematic approach, but I think that councils could collect those sort of those emails and phone calls, and you would be able to read a lot you learn a lot through those attempts to share those grievances. Often they are obvious. Sometimes they're not. I mean, sometimes like Bendigo has been making such an enormous progress in its development towards this progressive urban space that is really like a beautiful, like this, the coffee culture. But you tend to then overlook that some people may not like that, and because it's such a great, you know, you wonder, well, how could this be not supported by anyone? Isn't it great that we have a diverse and vibrant community? But it requires a bit of, you know, many councils have their surveys where you could find out. I think a good way would be to have alternative town hall sort of meetings where people can come together and discuss, share things in a sort of moderated but safe space where you can bring up concerns that you have. We don't, like, I think there's a possibility for alternative consultation processes. I think the trickiest part is how we balance the, you know, the non-progressive, I wanted to say ugly, but they don't have to be necessarily ugly, but there are elements in community that don't support a certain you know, development, a certain pathway towards more progressive liberal thinking. And what do we do with those people? I mean, we know that they are there. We know that about 15%, or know that 25% have negative views on Muslims. I mean, it would be a miracle to not have also at least some segments in any community, local community, where we have those sentiments. So how do we deal with them? How do we want to bring them out? Do we encourage people to express them, or are we happy to keep them sort of on the margin and not, because I mean, I'm not advocating for either or. I just think there's a risk of silencing those views, but if we talk about them, it has to be in a way where we don't endorse those views, obviously. But I remember one incident from Yarra, where there's a youth group, council-run youth group near the council housing, the social housing estate, and a person comes in, a young person comes in and makes racist, like says racist things about the Aboriginal community. How do we respond to that? Do we send him away? Because that's an expression of there's something going on there. If someone says that, it's mean something is happening there, a young person saying things like that. Do we send that person away, or do we try, and that's what the youth work in Yarra did, try to engage with that person? Because what happens when we send him away? We say, we don't want to see you at this youth group anymore. Do we think that he's going to change his views about racism? Probably not. But how do we engage with it? In a personal conversation, we have to find alternative ways to do that, instead of just sort of having our views that, you know, just ignoring those things that we don't want to hear. And I think that's a very, very important part in understanding the grievances that are out there.
There's a related question to that, which is, how do we give space to grievances without reinforcing or amplifying negativity? I don't know whether, Cristina, you have any views on that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky one. Mario may have a better answer. I think that for us, it's definitely a work in progress, managing grievances. I mean, the way that people can interact with council now in terms of those grievances is through, you know, a public question at a council meeting, or through if they're involved in any of the advisory groups that we have linked to council. We have special interest advisory groups, and they can be discussed, I guess, in that format where there is a councillor also, you know, present. You know, the example that I gave around the music venues was something that just popped up. You know, it wasn't something, it's not a standard practice for us, but it was something that we saw we needed to intervene in. I'm not sure what the answer is. I think that there has to be a safe space for people to be able to speak. It has to be moderated very skillfully as well.
Yeah,
Mario?
I agree. No, I mean, this is that I can't. I mean, I think no one can really give the answer. I think it's trial and error. I think generally speaking, we haven't been very good at acknowledging that it exists, and I think that's the first step, that we have to understand that by ignoring it and closing our eyes to things we don't want to see, it's not going to go away. Maybe an example is the the anti-lockdown movement. I think is an interesting example where people are now so embedded in a parallel universe, an anti-public, as Mark Davis called it, where there is no openness to negotiation anymore, no openness to discuss this. It's the fronts are clear. It's too late. I mean, nothing is ever too late, obviously, but it's much harder to get someone out of that space once you have a new sort of a camp that you can that seems to be listening to your concerns and your grievances. And winning those back is a big challenge. I think that safe spaces is in the Victorian multicultural position statement. There's a reference to safe spaces. We have to live up to that, and we know that it can be painful and hard and difficult, and we might fail occasionally, but we have to try it because there's no alternative to that. I think that ignoring conflict is something that, and I'm not Australian, as you can tell, but what I felt like was there's some hesitancy to conflict in the Australian culture, where we don't want to take it on really. When it gets nasty and difficult, then we turn to sort of social harmony approaches instead of pushing further when it gets difficult. And I think that's something that we could that could inspire us. Maybe my German straightforwardness, that is often seen as being a bit rude, is something that I'm not saying that you should learn from German rudeness, but you know what I mean. There's not stopping the conversation when it starts to hurt and be uncomfortable a little bit. It's about the general discussion about confronting racism in a context of racial injustice, where white people, like, we have to feel uncomfortable sometimes. It's the same with having discussions around those issues about vaccination hesitancy or lockdown. It is painful to have those conversations, but if we don't have them, then we are not going to make any progress in terms of building sort of or we are fragmenting the community more by ignoring the cracks, if I may say so.
Maybe it's linked to, there's a lot of bystander training that's being offered now and developed. Maybe we need to be doing more of that so that we get more comfortable in having those conversations. I know that, my opinion is we all sort of live in these bubbles where everyone that we interact with, the news that we receive, is all, from our own perspective, and we're getting less and less practiced at having those conversations. Maybe we need to get more in that space where we practice them.
Cristina, there's a question here which is a bit related to what you were just talking about then, which is, how does the council upskill workers to identify ideologically motivated violent extremism? Swastikas are easy to identify, but other symbols and groups can be less widely known.
That's a really good question. We haven't done that so far. Yeah, you're right. Swastikas are easily identifiable, and we're onto that, and phrases. But I have often I've just heard from Mario. We've had a conversation, and Mario's enlightened me. So we haven't actually gone into that space, but I think that that's certainly something that councils could explore, especially with the front-facing sort of nature of council services. It's definitely something. One of the things that we had started to work on with Mario and other local governments was a bit of was it a toolkit or a guidebook, a bit of a sort of a guide really for local government in terms of how to prevent or respond to far-right mobilisation or activity, whether it's active graffiti, etc. And it included sort of looking at all the various aspects of council departments that where it could intersect. And so, it was going to be sort of a bit of a how-to, what to do. And so that was something that we were working on, but we were sort of stymied by the pandemic, and we got sort of pulled, local government got pulled into other directions. I don't know, Mario?
I mean, I think I'm not aware of any local council maybe at least in Victoria, there might be something in New South Wales. I know that the New South Wales-based organization altogether now runs those seminars, so it's not impossible, and it would be, I agree, it would be important to do that. It requires a certain, it requires councils to understand that it's actually really relevant to them. I think what Cristina said before about the graffiti removal, if you don't know what to remove, you don't know. I think in most councils there's a sort of there are regulations, what's at a certain height you can remove it, but you can't go any further and things like that. You don't want to make those public because people could make use of that knowledge, but not in terms of content. I think there's a discussion about whether something is considered art or not art, and if it's sort of beautiful graffiti that looks nice, then it's not supposed to be removed. But what if you have a beautifully graffitied, hate symbol there? I mean, you have to understand what it stands for, really. Or,
And I think so. Just going to your point, Mario, about local government and the whole far right activity thing. Most local governments don't see it as an issue, or that they have a space in it, and they might work in the space of anti-racism or anti-homophobia, transphobia, that sort of thing, and working from those perspectives, but going that extra step around far right activity and mobilization, perhaps we're not looking at that as much.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure whether it should be sort of a subheading of something. It's not. I think we can't win councils over to invest a lot of energy in how to respond and address far right extremism. In many councils it does not happen, or it happens really on the margin. So it's a sort of a bad investment, or it could be seen as a bad investment. I think it's a broader issue. For example, the issue around anti-lockdown mobilization. It's not far right, but it is a little bit. But these are important questions. That's why we call that social, like harmful mobilization or political division or things like that. It doesn't have to be the far right as such, because that is a narrow focus. But in certain instances, we need to provide very specific information. If we don't know what the symbol 1488 stands for, then no one's going to remove the graffiti because they don't know. It's just a number for many people, but it stands for, it's messaging, public messaging and contestation of public spaces when you graffiti like this. So it is, I wouldn't want council, it's not up to me, but I wouldn't want council to really invest a lot of energy to just focus on the far right. And then when something that is sort of related but not fully connected comes along, then you don't know what to do. I think it has to be an awareness raising about the general harm that comes from that, and that also comes from other mobilization and other incidents and actions.
A few questions just about issues around government strategies and frameworks. One is that in Australia, most of the strategies relating to community resilience or violent extremism are national or state level ones. To what extent do they have an impact, or are they taken account of by local government? Is there a connection between the rhetoric and those strategies and what is implemented by local governments? Cristina.
Yeah, I can't say that if it's a legislative requirement, of course, it impacts local government. We are obliged, all local government councils are obliged to, ensure we have a human rights-based approach and that we comply with that legislation. And we're governed by the Local Government Act as well. But in terms of extremism sort of strategies at federal or state levels, I personally, I can't sort of speak to that from a Yarra perspective. But of course, with the overarching sort of, subscription to human rights legislation, and maybe that, counters that. I'm not sure. Sorry, don't have much of an answer there.
Mario?
I think there is a big gap there, and I think that's a really important question to ask. That it's on federal level and then a little bit on state, but where does it actually happen? It happens in a certain local environment. And let's not look at the online spaces, it's slightly different, but even in the online spaces, it's a person who sits somewhere locally and does it. So, I mean, I think that it would be very wise to start that conversation, but not lead the conversation at the top level, that let local councils acknowledge and find their ways, and especially provide funding to do that. I mean, in many other countries, local communities, it doesn't always have to be the council, it can also be local communities, but allowing them to shape the way that is not securitizing, that is not a top-down approach, but the local communities know best what's best, how to build that community resilience, to come back to that. I did work on the far right in Germany because before CVE was invented, and I think that was framed very differently there. It was mainly about encouraging a democratic groundswell, sort of, where people on the local level were activated in a way to stand up for democratic principles and egalitarian principles. And that's something that happens in local action, like the local action plans, millions and millions of dollars and euros in that case were pumped, and quite successfully and effectively pumped into local action plans that were developed locally in combination, like in a partnership between local police, but not policing, but they were just involved. Shouldn't have mentioned them first. Local communities, local council, local businesses, and they know what's best. And I think they need to be enabled and funded to do this kind of work.
We have a question here relating to whether you have any insights into best practices in local government monitoring and measurement in these areas.
I saw the question. I'm not quite sure. Measure and monitor what?
Well, I think it's relating to, if you're implementing some of these policies, how do you measure whether or not they're successful? Cristina?
Yeah, that is tricky. I think monitoring and evaluation needs to be built in to any strategy or action plan that you develop, and there needs to be recognition of the anecdotal information or the qualitative sort of information that is just as important as the quantitative data. It just depends, I guess, on what it is that you're working on, but I think that it's a tricky one, and especially in community development, we're often challenged by that evaluation and measurement sort of question. But I think it's always important to try and it's important to always include from the get-go, from the development of the strategy or the action plan. And maybe that needs to be done in consultation with the people being impacted. What are some effective ways of measuring any progress on the action? I think I've just gone blank. Mario, you might have some more insights there.
Maybe you can add to that, but I was thinking about the requirements to monitor the welcoming, like the progress within welcoming cities, like the biggest local government network that works in that space or that sits in that space. There is some kind of monitoring requirements, and we have now how many? 60? I think over 60 local government areas, local councils that are part of that welcoming city or welcoming Australia, welcoming cities network. Yarra is one of them. Most councils that I've worked with are part of that network. We have the Intercultural Cities Network that we only have, as far as I know, 3 local government. I think it's Merbanong, Ballarat and Melton. They also have a requirement to monitor and develop new action plans in that space, which is really great. There is something happening, but I mean, it requires a certain commitment to sign up to those networks.
I have a question here, which is probably the subject of another seminar, which is, if you could advise the Australian government on their social inclusion policy or anti-racism framework, what advice would you have? Mario.
Thanks, Rita. I saw the question from Rita come. There's so many, first of all, just focusing on anti-racism is something that I would have a lot to suggest, but I would also, maybe for me, the most important part is to engage those who are affected. Maybe this is where it all comes in. I wouldn't want to make any proposals to the government on anti-racism. I think the communities who are affected by racism should make that, and they should be given the platforms, and that they should be heard, I should say, because they are on the grassroots. They're doing such amazing work and doing so many great things that we can all learn from. And what did I hear? Like deep listening, as one of my colleagues who's also in the audience, she always says deeply, and I think that's what it requires. And that has to be then sort of filtered up to the top to be funded there, and then the funding has to go back to, and it should skip universities, it should skip the councils, it should skip off, not always, obviously, but it should go to those who really need that kind of financial support to put all their amazing ideas into action. Yeah. I think this community engagement is an empowerment. It has to be more than just a word. It has to be something that we really live in, that reflects all policy decisions in that space.
We're coming down to the last few minutes of this discussion. One question which is interesting, which has been raised about what is the role police have had in your projects?
Police?
Yes.
Police played an important role. We interviewed police, so in that sense, they were part of the stakeholder interviews. Local police it's very different. So sometimes local police are extremely aware of what's going on, and sometimes not. It's also a question of how long a person is within a certain area. We know that one problem with police is that the local police, that people move around a bit. So once you establish and connect with local communities, start to understand, then you get moved somewhere else, and that's a problem that I've learned from conversations with police. So I'm not the one who is criticizing. I'm just repeating what police has told me. But that was very important in different ways, but not as it was more in the community sector, not so much in the investigating issues, even apart from those rallies where police played an important role in mitigating violence at those rallies.
Cristina, any comment on?
Yeah, incredibly important to forge those relationships with police, and that is a problem, as that Mario's pointed out, that sometimes you've just got someone who knows the community so well and is well known by community groups and by council officers and knows the lay of the land, and then they get moved on, and then you've got to break a new one in, so to speak. But police are really interested in engaging with communities these days, which is fantastic, and with local government. So essential to have them on board in all aspects that impact community safety, especially. Yep.
Fine, very good. Now, the last question or issue which is raised is that even in communities without the benefit of core populations, there's a diversity of culture and thought and views, especially in social media exchanges. And I know, Mario, you spent a lot of time looking at these. It's a question, I suppose, that in addition to the work with local government, how does local government relate to some of these social media campaigns that are going on separately from their sort of engagement with communities?
Do you mean social media campaigns being conducted by community groups or organisations?
Well, it may well be just spontaneously arising issues that follow a particular strand of thought. Oh,
okay. Yeah, it's important to sort of keep on top of that, keep abreast of it, and to keep an eye on how that's playing out, especially if it's something that is potentially divisive or that may cause a bit of angst in the community. We tend to go to our networks and our relationships and engage with them to see what's going on and where we can be involved, really, if that makes any sense. To it's hard to sort of without an actual example, but just I keep saying it, relationships. It's all about that at local government. And the more you can foster those, the more you can go to them and, work out what's going on and see where you can interact as a local government, the better it is.
You and Mario, if you're in the last 30 seconds, do you have a final comment?
I think that was really good what Cristina said, so I leave it at that. I just want to mention that if anyone has any comments and questions, that they can email me and contact me, and we try to respond then if you'd like to continue the conversation. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cristina and Mario, for your presentations, and been a great conversation.